Tigger. I like Tigger. Right. I call this meeting to order for the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, record of attendance, please.
Councilmember Specker is joining us via Zoom. Councilmember Collins is running late this evening. So currently you have 6 council members present and 4 county commissioners joining us this meeting.
Thank you, and I welcome the County Commission to be here with the joint meeting with our housing study presentation. Before we do approval of the agenda, I'd like to make a motion to remove item 10E, ordinance 2022-022. Is there a second?
Second.
Any public comment on this item? Seeing none, is there any council comment? Please call the roll.
Tildenburn,
Aye.
Wendell,
Aye.
Avery,
Aye.
Doran,
Aye.
Niemeyer,
Aye.
Specker.
Okay,
Aye.
Action, motion passes. Action to approve the agenda as amended.
So moved.
Second.
Any public comment? Seeing none, any council comment? Please call the roll.
Wendell,
Aye.
Avery,
Aye.
Collins, Doran,
Aye.
Niemeyer,
Aye.
Specker,
Aye.
Tildenburn.
Aye.
Okay, with that being said, we'll go on to item 4. Brookings County and the city partnering with the Economic Development Corporation for a housing master plan. Desired outcome was an analysis of the existing housing market for single and multifamily, the number of needed housing types, price points, and type of housing desires and opportunities. RDG will present the findings from the 8-month project. Please state your name when you come up so we know who's talking.
Thank you. Amy Haase from RDG Planning and Design, Omaha, Nebraska. Thank you all so much. So, this opportunity to be here with you tonight and to present the final results from the study. I will say, I have a number of slides where we'll step through the findings in the study and some of the recommendations. If you have any questions as we go through this, please feel free to ask at any time rather than waiting to the end. I think it probably works better that way. So to start off with, we want to kind of just talk a little bit about how we organize the process. So we always start at the beginning with kind of just understanding where we are today. We do that through gathering some of the data, the market pieces of it, the census information, all of those things. We also conducted a series of small group listening sessions where we met with individuals here in the community and then and across the county, really, and then also conducted an online survey. We had over 1,000 respondents to the survey, so it was, I think at this point, it's our best housing study survey response we've had. I shouldn't say that, actually, you're going to get beat, but it's a much, much larger city. So in your size category of a county, you're by far beating everybody. We use that information then to consolidate together to identify our action items and what our goals need to be as we move forward. And then building on the goals, how do we implement those? What are some strategies? And then we're here today with the final report and an opportunity to take some feedback. I want to walk through a little bit. I'm going to give a high level. I can geek out on the data part and spend the whole hour just talking about that, which I doubt that's what you really want to hear. But so I'm going to hit some of the highlights, but if there's anything in this that you have some additional questions on from the fuller draft, I'm happy to answer those too. Starting with just kind of the general overview of what's happening with regards to the population overall. As you are all aware, the city of Brookings and Brookings County have been growing, and so have all of the communities really within the county. I would point out Aurora, and Aurora is a great example of taking some pretty aggressive action around housing, and that resulting in some significant growth for that community. We also begin to looked at kind of our overall housing makeup that we have today. I would like to point out on this slide the vacancy rate. So the vacancy rate, that's a pretty high number in 2020. And a couple things to note on that. One is I think it's a little reflective of what we were seeing with maybe some of the anomalies with the census that occurred in 2020, but also the fact that we did hear from especially on the landlord side, that there was maybe a little bit of a spike in kind of end of 2020, 2021 period, where we did see a little bit of an uptick in maybe some of the vacancies. But by the end of 2021 and going into this year, that had dropped dramatically, and we were seeing significantly lower vacancy rates on the rental side. And as you will see in the data too, those vacant units are not out there in the for sale market really either. So I just wanted to make that note. And I think this is also a great example where the conversations that we try to have are really important, because it helps us kind of confirm or figure out what's happening with regards to data. When we look at the sales data information, it's also very interesting. And when we look at this, I specifically, in the time period we're in today, asked to go back to 2019 so we can kind of see what has happened before the events of 2020 and what's happened after. As you can see on all of these, I think one of the interesting things is days on market dropped dramatically. So we're hearing about homes selling in like a day or two. And so that starts to get reflected in those numbers. The number of sales remained strong. So if a house could get to market, it sold. And so the number of sales remained strong. And as many of you are aware, we just continue to see, because of that competitive market and the low interest rates, those values also going up, or the median sale prices also going up. Here in Brookings, we've had pretty steady construction activity over this period, but except for 2017, we dropped below, and in 2020, obviously, everybody was being a little bit cautious going into the summer months when so much of our building activity would have been happening. So that did cause a little bit of a pullback, but we've, over the last decade or so, seen a good number of new multifamily units being built. But I will say what we were hearing in the listening sessions and what we saw in the survey was that there was still this need for kind of rental options, and maybe different types of rental options than what we've seen, and really across the board, and especially in our communities outside of Brookings, that lack of rental options and the needs there that we heard from many of the communities. We also take a look at affordability, and there's a couple different ways that we can look at affordability. One of those being a value to income ratio that we will look at. And so where you see kind of those pinkish or reddish colors, those are where our value to income ratio gets pretty high. It's over 3. So we say if that value to income ratio is above 3, we're starting to get into a market that's a little more unaffordable. But we also don't want to look at numbers that are below 2, because then we get concerned that what we have potentially happening is a gap between what it costs us to build and what something can be appraised at. That's a common phenomenon we see happening, especially in rural communities where we just haven't built much. So we're trying to use appraisals on homes that were built in the 60s and comparing those sometimes to new construction costs. So that's not an uncommon thing to have happen, but it does sometimes make financing new construction a little bit more difficult. So we always say either end of that spectrum isn't great. Now, I will also qualify this and say that it is not unusual for us to see those ratios over 3 in university communities, because we have a large population of individuals that have lower household incomes, and usually pretty strong home values across the board when we look at other college communities. I will also put in a caveat. One of the things that we saw when we looked at these numbers is there's another way of looking at affordability, and it's what's referred to as cost burden. So if a household's spending more than 30% of their income on housing, they're considered cost burden. And the census estimates that actually Brookings, the city of Brookings anyway, that the number of households that are cost burdened is actually pretty low when compared to some of your other peer communities and other university communities. So that's actually kind of a good sign. So it's another way that we kind of like to look at the data. So we're not just looking kind of at one picture that can get a little bit skewed from that. So here's that kind of top number that you see in the far right-hand column, percent of paying more than 30%. For owners, it's 8% estimated here in Brookings, which is actually a pretty good number when you compare some of those other locations and communities. It's also not unusual for us to see a much higher number among renters because, for the most part, especially since 2008, our banking community is pretty careful about making sure that people aren't getting into a situation where they're paying more than 30% of their income on housing. So that's where we tend to see it's more likely to occur with households in renter occupancy to see that higher cost burden. All right, there we go. Okay, another way that we can look at affordability is comparing how many households we have within an income range to the number of estimated units that would be affordable to that household. So I'm going to use the second from the top grouping, the households making between $25,000 and $50,000. So we would say that an affordable owner-occupied unit would be somewhere between $60,000 and $125,000 for those households. The census estimates that we have about 13,000 or 1,300, excuse me, homes in that price range. And this is countywide, by the way. And that we have rentals. We have over 3,100 rentals that are priced between $500 and $1,000, and that would also be what would be affordable to those households. So when we add together the 1,300 and the 3,100, that's more than the 2,900 that the census estimates that we have. So in theory, it would say that for households making between $25,000 and almost $75,000, that we have plenty of units. But we know that's not necessarily the case because we hear that from a lot of individuals. So all of those incomes making over $75,000, my joke usually is that they're not living in their cars, that they're living in those units that are more affordable to households making less than them. So what it tells us is that we actually have a pretty good supply of quote unquote maybe affordable units or moderately priced units. The problem is people are living in them. So we'll talk a little bit about how that correlates to some of the strategies that we need to be thinking about. Yes.
Amy, I think it was in the executive summary, renter-occupied housing in the city of Brookings, and it was close to 51%. I think
Yes.
the note was that was higher than the state or the national average, but I was curious if 51% renter-occupied housing in a peer type of college town
Is
is an
common.
inline number?
Yeah, that's an inline number.
Okay.
Yeah. I would say that's in line to some, I mean, just depending can be even lower. And when you drill down into specific neighborhoods, it can get even significantly higher. So that's not unusual. But yes.
The slide that you're on now, does that take into account the family size and number of bedrooms in the unit?
No, just the estimated value. And again, this is census information. So it's kind of what people are estimating on their census form too. Okay, so it's what we would call as a little bit more of that qualitative data. So it's what we heard from the survey. We asked quite a few questions, and all of that is within the study itself, and there's a little bit more detail in the appendix. But I'm just going to hit on a few of the highlights that I think you will maybe find kind of especially interesting. So one of the questions we asked was, does your housing supply meet the needs for different housing types or different groups of individuals? So most people felt, about almost 69%, felt that we're probably meeting the needs of students, but we're not meeting the needs as much for our seasonal workers, for multi-generational families, for families with children, and even some of our single young professionals. So I think that was actually probably a pretty common theme. I do also think it's really interesting, and we'll talk about this here a little bit more, that most people felt empty nester needs were being met, but that maybe some of our elderly single couples and so forth so forth weren't necessarily being met. I will say, though, in our listening sessions that we held, when we started asking folks, are there good options for empty nesters if they want to go to something that's a lower maintenance, or they want to move out of that 4-bedroom home that they raised their family in? And most of the time what we heard was no, that there really aren't a lot of great options across the county for those households. So that's a good example of where we're trying to combine as many different conversations and data points as we possibly can. We also asked about rating the supply of buildable lots. And as you can see here, the vast majority of individuals thought there was a moderate to severe undersupply of our buildable lots across the county. We asked what sort of product types households would prefer, and so these were some of the highest rated ones. And so a lot of these are more kind of owner-occupied sort of options that they thought would be pretty successful. But as you can see here, we're starting to get some variety that individuals are seeing we need in the market, which includes the one on the far right, which we call kind of that traditional. That's a 45-foot wide lot sort of unit. It actually does have a 2-car garage in the back, by the way, in that units. But obviously people are saying, hey, we need some more of those options, senior living, independent units, those types of options. And here again, you continue to see that variety of different product types and interests. I did find it really interesting that we actually saw pretty good support at 58% for accessory dwelling units. So I know sometimes those are, I have come to the conclusion, I think in some communities it's a love-hate. You either love the idea or you're like, oh, I don't know. But these are great options when we start thinking about multi-generational housing, which many of our respondents said we lacked. It's also, we're hearing, especially in really high-priced markets, it's a great way for individuals to build equity and to be able to afford housing. So they have maybe an equity-producing unit that they're using to help kind of pay for their housing in general. There's actually a community outside of the Quad City area in Iowa that they're actually seeing a lot of duplexes that are being built that young people are buying, and they're renting out the other side. They're living on one side and renting out the other, and they're using that to help cover some of their costs. We asked about perceived availability by residents for different rental homes in the past. So we specifically asked if they've looked in the past 3 years, because I think that's really important. If you haven't looked at a rental in 20 years, you're maybe a little skewed on your perspective. So a couple things to point out here. A lot of people felt there was an undersupply of the under $1,000 units. In our current construction market, and really even before 2020, we were probably having a hard time producing a new rental unit that was in that $1,000 range or so, the $8,000 to $1,000 range. Anything below that, and especially when we start talking about units below $500, if to produce those units, we either have to find them in the market that are existing today and we need to free them up by offering other options to those households, or we're talking about units that have to be heavily subsidized because it's just with our construction costs and so forth. And that was really true even back in 2019 before we saw the increasing costs in construction materials. That price point was almost impossible to bring to market without some additional assistance. So something to keep in mind. I have mentioned we also did a series of listening sessions. So we had some great conversations there. And I just wanted lots of things we hit on, but I'm going to kind of boil it down to kind of 3 or 4 reoccurring themes. No availability. Our for sale market is very limited. It was probably tight already in 2019, and it got severely tight starting with the drop in our interest rates. We really need to think again about workforce development as it relates to the building trades. We have a lot of demand out there for housing, but if we don't have somebody to swing a hammer or install a toilet, as I describe it, we're not going to solve many of our housing issues either. And then, and a couple other ones is the housing diversity, that we need more product types that are appropriate for every stage of life, from this college student to the young professional to the family to the next step up down to the empty nester and the senior. So at every stage of life. And then finally, and we see this in that affordability numbers, that we need to continue to invest in our older housing stock. It's going to be our best source of affordable housing. So we need to make sure we're preserving that, and in whatever ways we can, potentially preserving the kind of what's often referred to now these days as naturally occurring affordable units. So how do we make sure that they maintain some of their affordability? As we look ahead into some of the opportunities, we begin to look at what do we think our projected population is going to be. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the city of Brookings. One of the things we do when we look at a community like Brookings is we realize we can't just apply an annual growth rate to the total population, because what that would be doing is it would be saying that our student population would also be growing. Generally speaking, we like to think of student populations as ones that usually aren't growing, they're just kind of replacing themselves. And that's especially true right now. So nationally, the number of individuals in those age cohorts has dropped. Our millennials have gone through their college years, and we're into the generation that's behind them, and they are a smaller cohort. So just naturally, it has been dropping for universities across the country. COVID obviously has also had a significant impact on, and COVID and the recent economy have had significant impacts on student enrollment too, for multiple reasons. Some that are just deferring because they weren't wanting to be on campus. Some students that were saying the economy's hot, I can get a job and I don't need to go to school. And also the impact it was having on our international students' ability to actually get here to the United States. So when we pulled out the student numbers from the total population, the city of Brookings, when we look at the core population, grew by almost 2% annually, was seeing a 2% annual growth rate. And so that's dramatically higher than if we kept that student population in, which was just over 0.5%. So when we apply that to that core kind of constant population, we looked at a couple different annual growth rates, and then we add the student population back in. We're talking about a population anywhere from 26,600 to 27,600 or so, in that range of potential growth by 2035. The next step in the process, and I think there is a table in the document too that looks at each one of the communities. So we also looked at each community and what its historic patterns had been and applied that annual growth rate also. And then we also said we realize that some growth is going to happen in the county outside the jurisdictions. And we're going to talk a little bit about that more here as we talk about some of the strategies. But we realize that there is some interest in that product type and in that opportunity. So we did try to acknowledge a little bit of that. But I think for the most part, when we think about how we can grow most efficiently and use our dollars in the most efficient manner, it's using the infrastructure resources that we have today in many of our communities. When we look at specifically at Brookings, Aurora, and Volga and the potential growth that they have, and this is their demand out to 2035, we look at lots of things: the potential population growth, the number of people per household, our vacancy rate, but I tried to boil it down and keep it really simple here. We also look at number of lost units. So we assume that within a calculation that every community is going to lose a unit. Now, we can lose a unit by it being demoed. We can lose a unit because a house gets turned into an insurance office. We can lose a unit because at some point this house was divided into 3 units and somebody comes along and says, I'm going to turn it back into a single family home, and that's actually 2 lost units. So there's lots of different ways other than just a house being torn down that we lose a unit. So we acknowledge that, but we also realize that those need to be replaced so they get factored into the calculation. So you can see here in that middle row, the cumulative need. We also acknowledge that our other communities in Brookings County should also be producing some units too, but usually what we say is they should be producing about, because of where they're at population-wise, it would be great to see them adding 1 to 2 units on an annual basis, just kind of depending on the community size. We don't necessarily have to do kind of a whole big complicated spreadsheet model for them because of the size of the community. This begins to then break down, and this actually is not out to 2035. We just applied this to 2030 with our and used our current kind of household income breakdowns that we see today, and said, if we just project this out to 2030, what's that start to look like between the type of units that we need, between owner and renter, and then where do we think that falls in price points, again, based on our kind of current income makeups. So there's a couple things that I'd like to point out here. We tried to acknowledge that in some of our communities, especially Aurora, we were hearing we really need some rental units. We've done a great job of building some new single-family homes, but we do see the need for some additional rental opportunities in the community. We also, I want to point out here, fully realize that to produce a new unit priced below $250,000 is probably not going to happen without some significant subsidies or incentives. But we have those units in our communities today. They exist. We just have people living in them. So this is going to get back a little bit to our strategy and talking about diverse housing options and how do we kind of get people moving potentially out of those homes and freeing them up for our future population growth that we could have. In the same way, a little bit on that affordable rental side. So, we have those units that are priced between $500 and $1,000. We just, we have individuals living in them. So we need to figure out how we, again, create a little bit of movement in those rental markets too. I want to go into goals. I guess I'll maybe pause really quick. Did anybody have any questions before we move into kind of the next phase?
Amy, this is Bonnie Specker. I have a question. I noticed in the report that you talk about like the different types of housing that people feel is needed. And I was wondering if you happen to break that down by different age groups. For example, I think about 15% of the respondents were 60 years of age or older. And I was wondering what they perceived as the need for empty nesters. Like, was it higher?
Interesting. I don't, but that is something we could take a look at. And see if we can divide out the kind of cross-tabulate respondents who identified their age in those areas and how they responded to that question. So we didn't, but it's something we could definitely take a look at and get back to you on.
Yeah, I think that would be really informative. Thank you.
Okay. Question. So when we collect the data, we conduct the survey, we did the listening sessions, and as we mentioned, we start to see some of the common themes that start to rise to the top. And based on those, we identified some core goals for the overall plan, starting with how do we begin to create some mechanisms for sharing risk. So today, and this is going to tie into some of our other goals, but things like we do need more diverse housing options, but sometimes the market looks at that and says, it's not tested, or the cost of doing a subdivision today and doing subdivision development just doesn't look like it did 30, 40 years ago. We have a little bit different market economics. So how do we potentially sometimes share that risk? And we've seen some of the communities like Volga doing that and becoming more involved in those pieces. So we'll talk a little bit about the strategies there. We need to increase the variety of housing options that we have. So again, we have housing options at all stages of life. We need to secure and conserve our existing housing stock. Again, best source of our affordable housing. We need to encourage development in communities or in existing sites because it's really the most efficient way to use our resources that we have. Paving roads, extending infrastructure is not getting any cheaper. So where if possible, we need to use what's already in place, and we need to use it as efficiently as we possibly can. And then finally, we need to think about expanding our workforce development to include our building trades, because we have a shortage of that. And for the most part, a lot of our individuals that are in the building trades today are nearing retirement. And so how do we make sure that next generation is coming in and replacing them? So we're going to step through a few of the strategies as they specifically relate to these goals, starting with mechanisms for sharing risk. So what are some of the different ways that we can help share risk? So this should be thinking about really our objective here is how do we help builders and developers feel more comfortable with doing different product types and options within our market. This really takes a whole team effort. And in the document, we identify different partners that need to play a role here and the ways they can play different roles. There's different financing sources that we can use out there, but really one of the big things that we try to emphasize in this kind of sharing risk piece is how do we do this locally as much as possible? So, how do we involve, and one of the other things that I would that we could also maybe add to that responsibility, and I think we talk a little bit about it in the document too, is really our business community in general too. And BEDC kind of wears a little bit of that hat, but we're definitely seeing more of our major employers in a lot of communities that are also saying, hey, we're willing to give into a local fund that will potentially help with housing development for our workers. And we do note that up there, kind of housing opportunity funds or a local funding pool. And I often like to think of a local funding pool as no different than any kind of economic development pools that so many communities did 30, 40 years ago when they were trying to bring in an industry or other sources or kind of other economic development opportunities. It's really starting to frame housing as economic development. So how do we begin to encourage that kind of growth within our communities too? Years ago, I had an economic development official that I work with that would always say, I have more jobs than people. And if they move here, I don't have a place for them to live. So that was how he always kind of correlated the housing being really important to his economic development strategy. So there's different approaches that we can take there in thinking about that. But the one thing that I will say too about creating that local fund is you identify what you want the strings to be, as opposed to when you use state or federal dollars and they determine what the strings are going to be. So that's kind of the other advantage. You can craft something that's really appropriate to your communities. And I mean, the state and federal programs are great and they're great to tap into, but you have to realize that they're going to be very targeted to specific income groups, and we need those pieces too. But if you're talking about trying to build housing potentially for our households making between 80 and 120% of our area median income, then you're probably going to have to be thinking about how do we do that more locally. Increasing our variety of housing products. So we want to provide housing options for individuals at every stage of life. And again, this is really going to take a full range of individuals. We noted in the on the last slide the potential for a nonprofit developer, and I want to kind of pause here and talk a little bit about that. A nonprofit developer is a great way to provide those housing products that the private market just can't be successful at. So when we talk about those individuals, they're not competing with the for-profit side because they're really working in those price points and in the areas where the private market can't be successful. Or they're going to do a product that's maybe untested and has a lot higher risk. So if they break even, they're a nonprofit, it's okay. Or if they need some of that gap financing, where the private market's going to be like, yeah, no, I can't break even, I got to pay bills, right? And I'd like to, feed my family. So they can play that role a little bit better in many markets. And one of the things that they can do, and we'll talk about this more in preservation of our existing housing stock, is specifically related to some programs around rehab and so forth. But whatever we do, we just need to be thinking, and this one here I think especially ties back to how do we share risk. So how do we maybe lessen the concerns that the private market might have about the viability of different product types, especially when we start to talk about some maybe lower maintenance things that haven't been as tested here in the market, when we start to talk about things that have kind of shared maintenance and so forth that maybe we don't see quite as frequently in this market. We need to secure the existing housing stock that we have. So we're trying to capture that benefit of our existing houses and keep those kind of naturally occurring affordable units. I mentioned the nonprofit here, and one of the things we've seen some of the nonprofit developers be very successful at are programs like purchase, rehab, resale. So they purchase the home, they rehab it, and they sell it to a qualifying household. Now that usually means that they're an income qualifying household, so they're not, these aren't the units that are going to be probably selling for 250, 300,000. These are going to be our lower price point units. The other thing that I always emphasize is these are also usually not the homes that are on the verge of demo. These are most nonprofits are the most successful in taking that house that maybe needs $50,000 worth of work put into it, getting that work into it, and then maintaining it as an affordable unit. It's not uncommon for us to see in a lot of markets that, yes, there is some of that happening, but obviously it doesn't always maintain sometimes its affordability. We're also seeing some of those nonprofits getting involved in just trying to preserve owner-occupied affordable units. So in really tight rental markets, we start to see more outside investors especially. This is a trend we're seeing in the last 6 months, especially in many communities, where outside investors are coming in and buying single-family detached homes that had been owner-occupied and converting them into rentals when we have a really hot rental market. And so some nonprofits are starting to say, hey, how can we play a little bit of a role in preserving those units, not only on the affordability side, but as an affordable first-time home buyer option too. So that's another role that they can begin to play in that market. And it's literally something we've just started to see in the last, I'd say, 6 months. So that's been kind of an interesting piece of it. But there's lots of different programs out there that we can be using to help with some of those funding ways to fund those sorts of programs and preserve some of that housing. We also need to encourage development within our existing communities or existing sites. And so I'm going to go into, I've added a couple extra slides on this because I do think a little bit more detail and explanation here is kind of important. This specifically gets into lot development. And I like to start off by talking a little bit about the difference between a subsidy and an incentive. So an incentive is something that a community does to say, hey, how can we attract somebody to our community? And we know that the market's here. We just need to maybe share some of that risk, and we need to show that it can happen and kind of incentivize a developer to come to our area. So they're not so sure they can do small lot development, but will maybe assist with that type of infrastructure and lot development to kind of incentivize to come for a builder to come in and show that that type of product can be used. Or, Volga's a good example. They've done some things with TIF where they're sharing some of that risk on lot development. So that's an incentive that they were doing. Now, a subsidy is actually something where we're kind of helping maybe fill the gap. So there's a gap between what it's going to cost us to build it and what it's going to be appraised at, or what we would like to see it sold at if we're trying to meet a certain household income range. So then we maybe need to do a little bit of a subsidy or a gap financing. The other thing that I'd like to point out here is considering what I refer to as kind of right-sizing lots. So considering maybe some maximum lot sizes for in individual districts, especially when we're thinking about how we're kind of getting the most bang for our buck, especially if communities are being involved with helping with that development of the infrastructure. So I know a few years back, I was working with a small community. It was a countywide study, and they were doing some infrastructure. They were front-ending the infrastructure, and then they were letting them come in and do like 80-foot wide lots. And I was like, you are putting a lot of money out there to help with that infrastructure. You need to get as many housing units as you can on that linear foot of infrastructure. So just making sure we're kind of right-sizing and using those incentives in the most efficient way possible. So we can think of a lot of lot development tools. TIF has been done here. Volga's done that. We can also do special assessments. Some communities have done those. So that's obviously an extra cost on the final price of that a household is paying every month because they're paying off that infrastructure. Subordinate payments actually is an interesting one because when we were down at a 3% interest rate, I would have said, I don't know if that's really, a really great tool. But as our interest rates start to inch up a little bit, it does become a more interesting option. And what can happen there is that basically the cost of the lot and the infrastructure can be a second mortgage, basically, that could be done at a lower interest rate. So we're lowering the premium on the home itself, if that lot isn't figured in there, and what they're paying on the interest for that home. and then and setting that lot cost aside in a separate payment. Lot development across kind of our whole county. I want to take a minute to talk a little bit about rural lot development. So I think it's really important when we think about rural lot development to think about our return on investment and kind of thinking about that as a calculation. And so when we look at a new potential rural subdivision, what's going to be the return on the investment for the county for the additional services, for potential road extensions or pavings or so forth? And how do we look at that as with regards to maybe the property taxes that those developments are going to generate and pay for potentially additional services? The best example that I give here is I'm from Nebraska. We have fairly liberal annexation regulations, and so what we see most communities do when they're looking at annexing a subdivision is they kind of do a return on investment calculation. So they look at it and say, okay, what's it going to cost us to provide water, sewer? Well, they're probably already providing water, sewer, potentially, but what's it going to cost us to provide police and fire protection to this area? What's it going to cost us to take over maintenance of the streets in this area? And in a rural case, it might be what could be the potential cost if they come back and ask us for a paved road. So they look at that, and then they look at the property taxes that development is generating. And if those are out of whack, they're like, well, we're not going to annex that. So it's kind of that same kind of calculation of what is this going to generate to pay for the services? Are we breaking even? Are we covering our costs for the services that a new development could potentially require? I think it also then that kind of ties to establishing potentially some criteria for new rural subdivisions. We want access to paved roads. Again, going back to that, if we have that, then it's not potentially an ask that we're going to see in 5-10 years down the road going, well, the original developer didn't mind that we were off an unpaved road, but now everybody that's living out here would really like to have their road paved. And they come knocking at the county's door, right, asking for that. Not within areas that can feasibly be served by any of the cities. So again, infrastructure is not cheap to build, and when we have to jump around other subdivisions that are larger lot and are maybe not interested in tapping into those services, it adds significantly to the cost of development. Locations that are adjacent to existing rural developments or former homesteads. So we have a pattern, an existing residential pattern in those areas, which really does have, that I think is an indication that it can have a little less impact on our ag community too. So, because I think we can appreciate the fact that a lot of times our ag community members are saying, hey, we don't want we don't want this subdivision that then turns around and is struggling with the dust and the spraying and all of those things too. So I think those are all also really important kind of considerations of how we maybe direct some of that development. On the infill lot side and infill lot inventory, it probably would be a good thing for our smaller communities to do. What options do we have out there today that we already have all the infrastructure to? We maybe need to do some improvements to it, but we're not breaking new ground to do that. Brookings does have some existing policies around that already. And then finally, expanding our workforce development. Again, partnerships here will be really important. And I think it's thinking about how we address the labor shortage issue in this area, but it's also just thinking about it in kind of new and interesting ways. How do we sponsor? We've done, in rural areas especially, we've done sponsorships for people who are interested in going into the medical fields, who are willing to be in our communities as doctors and nurses. Maybe we need to start thinking about those types of strategies as it relates to some of our other skilled professions that we need to grow as a community. There are some state and federal programs out there. There's some programs like Build Dakota that's starting to think about those things, but partnerships with the economic development, with our local high schools who are already doing some of these, but how do we make sure that those programs stay strong within our local high schools and even our area technical college too, being a partner in filling that gap. This last one is probably a little bit more long-term strategy, right? Because a kid's not going to probably come out of school and start building houses immediately, but it's about our succession planning. So how do we make sure that that next generation is coming along to fill in the places where our folks are wanting to retire or move their business on to the next generation? So being really important. That's our last slide. So happy to answer any additional questions that you have.
Thank you, Amy. Is there any questions from council or county?
Thanks, Amy.
Yeah.
I think one of the big questions for county commissioners is, as we're thinking about rural development in our smaller communities and potentially rural subdevelopments, the support for the number of units needed was really focused on Aurora and Volga,
Yeah.
and not necessarily what people were asking for in terms of rural subdivisions or rural lot size developments or any of those types of things. Did you have any insight or conversations related to those items?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of interest, obviously, in the options for more rural subdivisions. But it really does correlate back to, I think, helping individuals understand that those aren't going to be our moderate priced units. Those are obviously they're helpful in what we call the filtering effect. So the individual or the households that want to move out of that, $150,000, $200,000 home to their little acreage maybe or something like that. But it's a small part of how we would potentially address the overall housing demand that we have. I think, too, we try to balance, as planners, we know the research says that most rural development does not support the infrastructure and the services that they need. I'll just be blunt. And, but we also have to acknowledge, I grew up in an acreage, I have to acknowledge that there's households that want that product type. So it's all about how we kind of balance that out. But to think about how we provide, especially maybe that workforce housing, the mid-range housing, and how we're using some of our public investments the most efficiently, it really does come back to focusing those on our communities themselves.
Are there any questions from the public? Okay. Thank you very much, Amy.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. It was great working with everybody.
All right.
Thank you.
At this time, I'd like to make a motion to accept the Brookings County Housing Study.
So moved.
Second.
And if there isn't any other comments or questions, call the roll.
Avery,
Aye.
Doran,
Aye.
Niemeyer,
Aye.
Specker,
Aye.
Tiltonburn,
Aye.
Wendell.
Aye.
Okay, so we'll take a recess. We had planned on starting the regular meeting at about 6:15, and so we'll do a little bit of a shuffle up here and take a recess. So there. Thanks for coming this evening to listen to the study.